Estás escuchando un audio del Grupo de Investigación Tiempha. Tiempha es un espacio de pensamiento, creación e investigación transdisciplinar que explora las relaciones entre arte, tiempo y ecologías contemporáneas. Este contenido forma parte de nuestras actividades académicas y de divulgación disponibles en nuestra web.
Hola, buena tarde a tothom. Buenas tardes. Gracias por estar aquí. Gracias también a Deirdre, que la tenemos aquí, Alejandra, que se conecta online, que está haciendo una residencia en Londres. Ahora nos explicará. Muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación. Ahora vamos a empezar la segunda mesa del simposio, que es una mesa que hemos titulado Tácticas, artísticas, reparadoras, retales de territorio, comunidad y memoria. En ella vamos a tener a 4 artistas y también diría que investigadoras, desde que están investigando desde la práctica artística. Tenemos a Deirdre Nelson, Alejandra Mirray, Mireia García y Marina Fernández Ramos. Y en esta mesa nos vamos a acercar más, como he dicho, a las prácticas textiles desde el hacer y desde ver cómo la materia textil tiene la capacidad de generar comunidad también y tejer y sostener memorias. Las artistas veremos que trabajan desde contextos y metodologías muy diversas, pero comparten una atención profunda a lo textil como espacio donde se entrelazan historia, territorio y construcción de formas de vidas, ¿no? Desde la práctica situada y los procesos de reparación y memoria en el trabajo de Deirdre Nelson, también pasando por el proyecto colectivo de Alejandra Mirray y las banderas de Tucumán, que activa genealogías, autorías y desplazamientos a través de un museo móvil, como veremos, hasta la exploración de Mireia García de los objetos textiles como dispositivos de memoria y traducción entre lo íntimo y lo colectivo. Y también veremos el proyecto de Tejiendo la calle de la mano de Marina Fernández Ramos, que convierte el hacer textil en una práctica comunitaria capaz de transformar el espacio público y tejer vínculos. Todas ellas, como veremos, nos invitan a pensar lo textil no solo como práctica, sino como una forma de relación, de transmisión y también como una forma de construir mundos. Entonces, bueno, sin más, voy a hacer la palabra a Deirdre Nelson, que es la primera ponente de la mesa de hoy, que es una mesa que, como habréis visto en el programa, está partida en dos, porque vamos a hacer una pausa en medio, ¿vale? Para facilitar también el descanso y que podamos escuchar con más atención, y haremos el debate al final de todo, ¿vale? Alejandra se tendrá que ir antes, así que si alguien quiere hacerle preguntas, quizás si te parece bien, Alejandra, nos lo comentas, lo podemos hacer un poquito antes de que te vayas, en vez de al final.
Sí,
Entonces,
ay, disculpe,
perdón.
perdón, creo que como el horario es diferente, creo que sí voy a poder estar,
Ah,
porque
vale.
no me había dado cuenta que allá es una hora más y
Sí.
puedo hasta las 7,
Ah, qué bien.
así que sí voy a poder quedarme.
Perfecto, pues muchas gracias. Vale, pues presento a Deirdre Nelson. Is an Irish artist and designer based in Glasgow. She studied textiles at the Glasgow School of Art in 1992 and completed a Master of Philosophy in 1996. Her work has been exhibited both in the UK and internationally. Her solo and group exhibitions include The Kildas at Glasgow School of Art, which later toured in 2016, Design with Her at the Saint Etienne Design Biennale in 2013, Between the Line at the Harbour Fronts Art Centre in Toronto, also in 2013, White at La Porte in Noyon-sur-Serein in 2011, Close at Hand at the Owens Gallery in Sackville, also in 2011, and Unexpected Guests, Homes of Yesterday, Design of Today at the Poldi Pezzoli Museum in Milan in 2010. A lot of work Deirdre is doing. Her commission work includes projects for Orchiview Continuum Care Facility in 2016, the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in 2009, and the Shetland Museum and Archives in 2006. She has also undertaken residencies at Wodomso Wetlands in 2017 and 2018, the Icelandic Textile Centre in 2018, Caterian Common in Scotland in 2017, Platform Arts in Glasgow in 2016, Timespan in Helmsdale in 2015, the Wigtown Book Festival and Cove Park in 2010, and IASKA in Western Australia in 2008, and Curtin University in 2007. She's currently a lecturer in product design, social innovation at the School of Innovation and Technology at the Glasgow School of Art. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Deirdre, what I'm looking forward to hear, and who will present Stitching Place, Material Memory, and Contemporary Craft. Thank you, Deirdre.
So thank you very much to everyone who's invited me here today, and to Anna for putting this together. I had a fantastic time in Glasgow with Anna when she came to study, and we shared a lot of amazing conversations, and it's a real pleasure to be back again and also to see her progress in her PhD. And I hope to come back at the end of it as well. Hopefully there'll be a celebration or something that I can come to at the end of it all. I am Deirdre Nelson, and by way of introduction, I thought I'd give you a little bit of my background. I grew up in Ireland from a family who was, on my dad's side, very creative, and mainly the women in my family were all textile makers. So I suppose I grew up with textile as a second language. It was part of my life. I wore clothes that my mum had made. I learned skills from my grandmother. I suppose I'm of a generation where my family made their clothes, or made clothes that their children were put into. And it's become, I suppose it's always been part of my life to be surrounded by making. I've always been curious, always wanted to travel, and I left Ireland to travel to England first of all, and then to Scotland to study. But I've carried on that sort of curiosity and that interest in travel and going to different places. And through residencies, working with a variety of community groups, I've had quite a varied career, working in a lot of different ways. And I'm now, I suppose, assessing where I am in my career and what I'm going to do next. I turned 60 recently, so it's my plan is now to think about how I use the rest of my life making, and think more about what I want to make or what I don't want to make. So I suppose I've had a nomadic practice really for 20 years, doing artist residencies and moving around, being inspired by different communities. So I was thinking about how to place this. I'm not really an academic, but I was thinking about how I could think about how to explain my work. So I'm very interested in social history and archives. I'm very interested in creating work about place, but also working with people. And I'm also very interested in how you can link past and present and make work that is relevant today, but using textile skills from the past. So I thought I'd take you on a little bit of a journey, and tell a few stories of textiles. And I was thinking about some of the things that we discussed earlier, or that were discussed earlier, which we're talking about, you know, not presuming too much when you look at archives. And I suppose I was thinking about myself in a slightly opposite way, thinking I often try and fill in the gaps, and I often try and make up my own stories to fill in the gaps or the bits of information that are missing. So the first story relates to the Shetland Isles, which are in the north of Scotland. And I discovered this this fact, when I was researching some work. I had an idea to make an exhibition about the dangers of sewing and knitting. I'm always looking for, a bit like Jessica's projects, I'm always looking for the darker sides of things, or the sort of humorous stories related to textile history. And I went to the archives in Shetland, and one of the guys told me, he said, "Oh, I've got the perfect thing for you." He said, in the past, women used to knit fishermen's socks, and they would barter them for gin at the port. So they would wait for they would knit all winter when it was dark, very early in Shetland. And then when the summer came and the Dutch boats came in, they would barter their knitting for gin. And I was thinking about this and the amount of socks you would need to knit for your gin. And I looked at the amount of socks you would get for the amount of gin, and worked out that you would have to knit 3 socks to get a pint of gin. I don't know what that is in litres. I'm not, and I was thinking about this, the idea of like 3 socks, you know, we wear 2 socks, but I think for the knitters, they would be just knitting constantly, and they wouldn't really think about it in terms of 2 socks for, you know, for one person. And I began to look at how many, in a very mathematical way, look at how many rows of stitching you would need to do to make up your pint of gin. So I made these socks, which I've called gin socks, and they basically have the measurements that, so for 1 fluid ounce of gin, you maybe would have had to knit 20 rows of knitting, right up to the end of the 3rd sock, which is 1 pint of gin. But I suppose it was a humorous piece, but also looking at things like labor and looking at value of labor and time and the time involved in knitting something like this. They were knit in Shetland wool. I always try and find I suppose the right material for the job, an authentic material to make the work. So the measurements were embroidered onto silk and then stitched onto the edge of the socks. And the socks were following a traditional pattern that was in the archive for socks of that time, fishermen's socks that would have been worn underneath boots. So moving on, I said, you know, I told you I'm Irish. More recently, I've been very interested in, although I live in Scotland, there has been an amazing revival in Irish culture recently and in Irish language. And I was asked more than 10 years ago to be part of an exhibition called Modern Languages. And the artists that were chosen for the exhibition were artists that had moved away from Ireland, but living in other parts of the world, but actually were asked to look at at Irish craft and actually reinterpret it or look at it from their perspective as someone from outside the country. So I was asked to look at textiles for the exhibition. So one of the things that interested me was the idea of a souvenir in Ireland, and I'm sure you have the same in Spain, but the Aran jumper is something that people think is stereotypically Irish, and it's a souvenir that you buy when you go to the west of Ireland. So, and these were, they're associated with the Aran Islands on the west of Ireland. But actually, when I looked at the history of knitwear in the island, people never wore these jumpers. They were introduced as a way of boosting the economy, as a way of sort of reviving women's income in areas where people were living in poverty. So, and it's unsure where the patterns have come from, but from looking at textiles over a long period of my career, you know, knitting has traveled all the way around the coast of Ireland, Scotland, right down to the south of England, and at each place, mainly with herring industry, the fish industry, and patterns were swapped and stories exchanged, techniques swapped. So I think it's, you can't really sometimes associate one technique to, it's a accumulation of a long history of textile techniques. And so I was quite interested in this idea of, you know, it's nearly like this has been imposed onto the Aran Islands in a way. You know, obviously it was something to boost the economy, but it was never a traditional thing. People wore plain jumpers, or sometimes they wore jumpers that were dyed in woad. It would have been the only sort of dye plant. So I was quite interested in this and actually trying to create some authentic textiles, or textiles that questioned authenticity. So I found an Aran jumper on eBay, and unfortunately, this is where a lot of Aran jumpers end up. I think people buy them when they're a tourist, and then often they don't wear them. So I found a jumper on eBay, and it was badly felted. It had moth holes. So I basically tried to revive the jumper and bring it back to life through careful care of the wool. And then I wondered about how I could sort of retell the story of the Aran jumper or the reality, or also tell both sides of the story. So I decided I would rip out half of the jumper and then reknit it as a plain jumper, so that only half of the jumper would be Aran. So this was the final jumper. It was called Aran 0.5. And I'd edged the neck with red. Often, you know, we see black and white photographs of the islands. I'm sure it's the same in Spain, but you often don't realize the rich color that people wear. And on the Aran Islands, women used to wear bright scarlet red skirts. Now, I'm not sure where the dye had come from, but it was quite a vibrant, colorful place. But we tend to think of these old traditions as, you know, we see them in black and white. So this was part of a touring exhibition. There was a ceramicist, a furniture maker, a basket maker, and a visual artist. And we all made work. It's a very interesting exhibition. If anybody's interested, I can send you more information. But this jumper also went to the Design Biennale in St. Etienne and was part of a selection of cultural objects there. And it was exhibited in a variety of venues across Scotland and Ireland. And then additionally for this exhibition, I decided to look at that time, I always try and link sort of, or think about what's happening now in relation to some of the crafts, or in terms of thinking about tradition and again, thinking about souvenirs. So I wanted to make, at that time, it wasn't long after the financial crash. And I know Spain suffered badly as well as Ireland and Iceland. I don't know if you know about, in Ireland, there's a thing called a ghost estate. And it basically in Ireland, when there was a sort of boom time and Celtic Tiger, when things were very good economically in Ireland, a lot of building work went on. There was a lot of overproduction of housing in Ireland. And then when the financial crash happened, the houses, there wasn't money to complete the housing. So a lot of these houses were left to just, basically they never got renovated. They just declined. They weren't maintained. So, but now there is a phrase called ghost estate, but in the Irish language, it's known as the fairy estate. So it's sort of the estate of, there's a lot of stories about fairies and protecting areas where there have been fairies. But I think it's quite interesting that that's where the Irish language word comes from. But I started to think about a new souvenir. Often in Ireland, there's souvenirs which are little cottages, small cottages. And I was thinking about the Monopoly house and what I could make. And I ended up making it was a money box. So it's a knitted money box. And the idea, I suppose, is that it's futile, really. It's just, you know, you even to get your money out, you have to rip out the whole house to get to your money. I had wanted to maybe make a knitting pattern that, you know, people could knit their own money boxes, but actually sometimes I work quite intuitively. And then when it came to try and write a pattern for it, it was so difficult to try and go back. And so, but this house was on exhibit, but then recently it's come out of my archives. What I've realized is that I now have an archive of work that often sits in boxes in my house, and it's quite nice when work actually has another life. And recently there was an exhibition called If Only We Had the Space, which was about housing in Glasgow. And it was a group of artists who'd looked at an archive to do with housing conditions in some of the big estates in Glasgow areas maybe where people are living in poverty, where there isn't good housing and there isn't very good maintenance of housing. So I was very excited to be in this exhibition because it was young contemporary artists who were putting it together. And it was very nice to actually take a piece of work that I'd made you know, 13 years before, and actually realized that it was still relevant. And I know housing is a big, from talking to Anna, is a big problem in Barcelona as well. So I think it's something that is a problem everywhere. So the exhibition was a mixture of artwork, craft work. It was also archival, a lot of information about protests to do with housing, to do with housing cooperatives that were set up, a women's build your own housing project. And the exhibition was really beautiful. It had quite a domestic feel, but it also was about activism and protest. And there was some beautiful archival, this is some leaflets. It was the women tried to build what they called a women's house, and it wasn't just a safe refuge for women, but it was women making their own choices about what type of housing they wanted to live in. So we're moving sort of back to Scotland again, and I was very lucky to go to an island called Fair Isle, which is I don't know if you've heard of Fair Isle jumpers. It's where the tradition of Fair Isle, the second image is this patterned knitting comes from. And I was invited to go there as part of a project where musicians and writers and filmmakers were making work about the ecology of Fair Isle. We were also making work that was in, I suppose, protest as well about the marine conditions around the island. They were trying to make the island a marine protected area. So it was really interesting, and to go and actually be with local people. So rather than just parachuting in, making work and going out, we really felt we were part of the community there. So I realized that when I was there that a lot of mathematics and counting goes on in a place like Fair Isle. They have an amazing bird population, protected, a lot of amazing protected birds. And they also have an observatory where people come and they count birds. And I suppose a lot of citizen science where people are making records of what they've seen and the changes due to climate. But I also realized that there was a lot of counting going on both in the stitches of the I suppose the knitters and the bird people were interdependent on, or not interdependent, but the island was dependent on the knitting as an income for a lot of the women on the island, but also tourism. A lot of people interested in birds would come to the island, and that boosted the income in the island. So I spoke to an older lady there, and she was describing knitting as, she said, first of all, it's maths, and then it's, I've put counting, I meant art. It's maths, then art, then knitting. So basically she has to work out the mathematics of her, whatever she's going to make. This was a jumper she'd made for her husband based on the colors of the island. So she obviously has to count, then she has to work out her colors, and then she can start to knit. So, and I suppose you can say that for a lot of textiles, is that there's a lot of counting that goes on in a lot of textile processes. There's also a lot of counting and noticing that goes on in terms of the ecology of the island. Every week an ecologist on the island would go with a group of local people, and they'd basically observe what was in on the island, what had changed, what they discovered in the tidal pools in terms of fish or insects, and they keep records. So records have been kept for a long time on the island, so they're documenting their own island in a really I suppose minuscule way. So I was trying to think of maybe a way I could use some of my skills to make something. And so I started to look at the bird numbers, and I started to document the numbers, and then begin to sort of, I suppose, plot the data. And then I began to think about what I could make. And I ended up making a hat, which was basically a period of time, the data of a period of time documenting the birds. So just a close up, and I used Fair Isle wool from the local area. And this is also another piece that it exists as a sample, but I would really like to make a garment with it. And it's basically the decline of one particular type of bird in Fair Isle, the decline of that bird, which is called a kittiwake. I think that it's maybe blocking off the bottom, but it's like a graph basically that was down. So, but on that project, I worked with a musician called Inga Thompson, who is from Fair Isle, and she is from a generation of amazing craftspeople and knitters and musicians, and they're quite a famous local family. And we looked through her grandmother's knitting patterns. Her mother is a machine knitter. So we looked at her graphs, and then Inga began to plot. She plays the accordion, and she began to plot new music based on the knitting patterns of her grandmother and her mother. And the project ended up in a performance where we animated some of the knitting patterns. And she created a whole range of songs, and this became part of the protest against the marine protection protest. And this was also exhibited. Again, I really like when work has a new life somewhere else. So some of the work was exhibited in an exhibition about drawing, and I found that really interesting. And it was so nice to see drawing or the plotting of knitting patterns seen in the same way as something like drawing or more traditional drawing methods. So I thought I would show you something that is based in Glasgow. And so the journey to Shetland and Fair Isle and Ireland has stopped. And so in 2020, like all of us, we were positioned in one place. And I was asked to make a piece of work for an exhibition in 2019, but then lockdown happened, and the work became even more relevant when I made it for the exhibition, even though the commission happened earlier. And I now am mainly based in Glasgow. I'm not doing as much residencies and travel. So I'm seeing my work in a slightly different way, and it's a less nomadic, maybe less place-based work. So this exhibition was called We Are Commoners, and it was looking at the idea of commoning as a collective practice. And I don't know, what would be the Spanish word for commoning? Do you know? Yeah, maybe you don't have, yeah. So it's commoning, I was thinking about, so I know in English, it was looking at the idea of like what we share as common resources. Often it was a word to talk about land, and land that was communal land, and not, it's often used to do with land ownership. But this exhibition wanted us to look at commoning in a wide sense, and the idea of commoning as collective practice and as sharing resources as a social practice. So for the exhibition, I decided to look at my local area, and this was before COVID, but then when COVID came, it became even more important. So this is, my street. And then I looked at, first of all, from my house. I live on a what we call a tenement in Glasgow. It's Victorian flats. And there's a lot of common resources. We share gardens, we share hallways. We often share duties or jobs within the apartment together. So I looked at my local area, and then I mapped the green spaces in my local area. And I decided to only look at within 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers within my house. But I wanted to look at, I realized that there were a lot of things in my area that actually were about commoning. There was, repair cafes, community projects, communal growing orchards. There was a lot of things going on that I think maybe were overlooked, or people maybe don't, it just is natural. They don't think anything special is happening, but I wanted to celebrate those things. So, and I wanted to maybe see what I had in terms of local resources, and use materials that were maybe more environmentally friendly, thinking about the climate as commons, I suppose, as well, and thinking about, making sure I was making good choices about the materials I was using. So I did some natural dyeing from plants that were in my local park, and then decided I would embroider, first of all, a map of my local area. So this is the map, and I wanted to make it slightly abstract. It started to nearly become like a globe or a world. It was my world within 3 kilometers, but it became, I suppose, the map itself became something much, much bigger. And this is just a close-up. The technique is a couched thread technique where you lay down threads and then stitch them over the top. And then I came up with the idea of, let's see if I can move this down a bit. Yeah. A fictional guild of commoning. So I don't know if you know the word guild. Is there a word? Yeah. So in medieval times, you had a guild of embroiderers guild or a metalworkers guild. And I wondered what about celebrating, creating a collective guild of commoning. So people that were doing things that were for social good or for communal good. So I looked at the idea of badges and gold work technique. I quite like finding traditional techniques that I can work with. And using the natural dye colors, I came up with I suppose, color reference for each thing. So certain colors represented different things. And these were embroidered, just small scale. I wondered, first of all, if I should make a logo or something like that. But in the end, I decided to work only with color and think about them as, I suppose, slightly more abstract. So I then took each badge out to the location, and they were photographed on location. So this one was outside. We have a fantastic bookshop in Glasgow for LGBTQI groups, and it's one of the first in Scotland. So one of the badges were for them. There was a badge for, I think, the next one. This was for the local Sikh mosque, Gurdwara, not mosque. And they provide free meals for people every day. You can walk in and have free food. And so I just chose places within the city that were that it was important to celebrate. So, and this was part of a touring exhibition. And there's a lot of information online if anybody's interested in this exhibition. Some very interesting projects it was all crafts people, but all looking at different types of commoning under the theme of commoning. And there's some very good educational resources as well. And in the exhibition, my new world was exhibited with the badges on strings from the locations. It became like a galaxy, I suppose, of information. So, and I was trying to think how to conclude, and I find it really difficult because there's so many projects I'd love to talk about, but I suppose now I'm at a stage where I'm looking back at work that I've made, and I'm trying to think of what I want to make, and maybe thinking about making less. I've made a lot of work over a long period of time, and now I want to be very selective about what I make and also what materials I make it in terms of, I suppose, what I leave behind. And so I've worked a lot with archives, but now I realise that I've collected this archive of my own work. So I've been given work to museums and educational institutions, and thinking about, what I would like to do next. And at the minute I'm teaching. I've done a lot of community residencies, and I'm very interested in the students I work with who work within social design, and they're making amazing projects for social good. So I suppose watch this space, what happens next. So thank you very much.